All right, all right, all right. Good morning, good morning. My name's Donnie. Last name's Glover. Entered the winner for the long haul, baby. All right. So today, I guess, is John Muller, and we're going to talk about one of my favorite people in history, Frederick Douglass. John Muller, how are you, sir? Professor.
Hey, great. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having me on the Donnie Glover Show.
Man, the pleasure's all mine. We're on the John Muller show today.
Okay.
John, how did you come to love history?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. Well, as probably many of your viewers in the fourth grade in Maryland public schools, I believe you receive education or introduction to local history. So in the fourth grade, I first became familiar with Maryland history, the counties, the Eastern Shore, Western Maryland. And ever since then, I've been interested in local history. I had the benefit of a great history teacher in high school. And so I've always liked, Civil War era history and studying presidents. And as I've gotten to be an adult, walking around, I always pull over and look at the historical markers. And so probably just my own intellectual curiosity, just like a lot of people.
No, it had to be nurtured somewhere, John. What was the first thing you researched?
When I was when the movie JFK came out, I became very fascinated in, I guess, elementary, middle school with the JFK assassination. So that was my first history wormhole that I went down, was the JFK assassination. I did have a poster of Frederick Douglass on my wall as a kid, so I've always had an interest in Douglass. It just took some years to develop into more of a professional historian with Mr. Douglass.
So let me ask you, how old were you when JFK got killed?
Well, I was not living when
born?
I was not living when JFK was assassinated. I believe the movie came out in 1992 or 93, so I would have been in about the second or third grade. And the so the process of just researching the Kennedy assassination, this was before really the internet even existed, but I used to go on the early internet and search for all sorts of conspiratorial articles and interviews and just learning about the JFK assassination. It's probably the first time I've thought about that in a long time. It's a great question.
I've got one to match.
Okay.
One story that really prompted my thinking was the death of Ron Brown, former U.S. Commerce Secretary. He got shot down over Bosnia-Herzegovina.
I remember when
that case alone. And you talk about the early days of the internet. There were only certain things that you could read about it. It was classified before classified. You knew they didn't want you to know for so much. You knew they didn't want you to ask for so many questions. But they found a round hole in his head, which many of us believe was a bullet hole. So the plane got shot down.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that case, other than just that, as I recall, Ron Brown was the Commerce Secretary at the sitting Commerce Secretary under President Clinton. He was very involved in the Democratic National Committee, and I've heard some of the chatter over the years and had the opportunity to speak at Ron Brown Junior High School in DC, but I am not studied on those theories, so I will trust your expertise.
I actually got a chance to work with his son when his son ran for office over in DC, Michael Brown. Okay, so let's get into a little more about you. Where are you from?
I grew up in a small little town by the name of Brookville.
Where you from?
Oops, hold on. I think
I grew up in a.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got two different computer screens. Okay, start over again. So yeah, I grew up in a small little town called Brookville, Maryland. It is in Montgomery County on Georgia Avenue. So the town's claim to fame is that it was capital for a day. In the War of 1812, which Baltimoreans will know very fondly because the Battle of North Point is where basically America was saved when Baltimore Harbor was defended. Francis Scott Key wrote the poem Star Spangled Banner, etc. So during the War of 1812, President Madison fled the White House, and when he was on the run, he stayed for an evening at the home of the postmaster in this little town of Brookville. And so his claim to fame is that Brookville was the capital for a day, August 26, 1814. So maybe growing up in that little town and always hearing about history, I've had a proclivity to be interested in history. And Georgia Avenue, as you may know as well as some of your viewers, it's an old historic road that predates the founding of the country. It runs today from the 7th Street Wharf or the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., the 7th Street Wharf. You take it straight and you get all the way to Gettysburg. So Georgia Avenue is an old historic underground railroad route, and it's kind of in the middle of the state. It's a little closer to D.C., but Baltimore is not too far away. So that's where I grew up and have lived in the D.C., Baltimore area for my entire life.
So as you were talking, one thing that came to mind was, you mentioned Georgia Avenue. Do you know about Benjamin Banneker?
I know about Mr. Banneker's role in the Boundary Stones. I have a dear friend who is a civil engineer and is he's a preservationist for the current Boundary Stones. And as you know, in 1791, 1792, there were 40 boundary stones placed around the 4 10-mile square of the district. And Mr. Banneker was, I guess, commissioned or hired to figure out the coordinates for the southern boundary stone at Jones Point, which I'm not a civil engineer or mathematician, but mathematically or scientifically, that was the most significant calculation, that if you had the southern boundary stone or boundary point, then you could begin to erect the square. So I've spoken at the Benjamin Banneker Park Museum in Oella, Maryland. Ellicott City is not very far from where I grew up. It is possible that Benjamin Banneker traveled up and down Georgia Avenue. Sandy Spring is an adjacent community. I actually went to high school in Sandy Spring, and 108 Clarksville is right down the road. So I don't know if this is all relevant. I am not a Banneker scholar, but he is a very gigantic figure in Black history, but also just American scientific history as well.
Now help me out. My understanding is Banneker memorized the plans for DC, like the plans were lost or something happened and the country depended on his memory.
I am not a scholastic authority on Mr. Banneker. My familiarity with Mr. Banneker is that.
But hey, you've been to Oella.
Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of how do I say this politely? There's a little bit of mythology about Mr. Banneker, where, as I understand, the George Washington was a surveyor, Thomas Jefferson was a surveyor. these founding fathers, Lincoln was a surveyor. They had certain mathematical skill. And when Washington, D.C. was the process of basically creating the city, these very learned men essentially acquiesced and acknowledged that Benjamin Banneker, who was largely, I guess, a self-taught mathematician, astronomer, that he had a superior understanding of astrology. This was before electricity, so all of the hand calculations were done on a circumferer and kind of these very almost like a protractor. So Banneker's calculations determined the I don't know what the technical mathematical term is. Basically, the access point of which you would start and then go up and then over and then that. So Banneker's calculation had to be exactly precise, which I believe in the 1990s, the geodetic survey went out and determined that basically Banneker was spot on. He was maybe off by like a half of a quarter inch or something. Basically that Banneker in the 1791, he was there March, April 1791. And then he went back to his homestead in what is currently Baltimore County. He corresponded with Jefferson, or he sent Jefferson a copy of his almanac, because one thing I feel that is lost in the history of Banneker is that he was a publisher or a writer, and he published several almanacs. And I believe the almanacs were published in Philadelphia. And the story of him recalling from memory a map, yeah, I'm not horribly familiar with that. I'm more familiar with the other things I just shared. But Benjamin Banneker is someone who's a fascinating figure. And to tie it a little bit back to Douglass, I have I believe in the 1870s, Douglass and some other individuals, pastors with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, went to Oella to try to determine where Banneker was buried at that time. And I believe they did locate where he was buried. I believe there was an obelisk there. And so Frederick Douglass, in studying American history in his own life and times, was aware of Mr. Banneker. And in 1878, I believe it was a daughter or granddaughter of one of the Ellicotts, Martha Ellicott Tyson, put together kind of like a memoir of people who had known Banneker, and she wrote Frederick Douglass asking if Douglass had any information or knowledge about Banneker. And so I don't know how that answered your question. You asked great questions.
You are fascinating. This is my book, and we have two heroes in this book. I look at how the people got to Oklahoma, and I found out they came out of Florida. But I also realized that it wasn't a simple 1, 2, 3 story. Because before Black people, well, the first wave went into Oklahoma in 1843, but afterwards, a large number of Blacks escaping the Deep South went into Kansas. And you know why Kansas was popular, right?
Well, Kansas, according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, believe it was supposed to be anti-slavery or popular sovereignty. I might be getting my early American history a little bit off, but that's where John Brown and his some of his raiders basically were in Kansas in the 1850s, and John Brown were the anti-slavery advocates, and
he's my hero, man.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
I
believe John Brown and his
sons.
Yeah, I was gonna say John Brown caught some bodies, as the term would be in Kansas.
He's my hero. He fought for Black people. He was shooting people. He wanted no more. Did you know he and Harriet Tubman and he and Frederick Douglass were chums?
Yes, I'm not as knowledgeable about Harriet Tubman and her history as I am about Douglass, but Tubman, Brown, Douglass all worked within the ecosystem of kind of these radical abolitionists out of New York, New England. There was a guy named Garrett Smith, who was a New York guy with lots of land. He worked with Tubman. I believe Douglass and Brown knew each other for about a decade. There is in the 1870s, early 1880s, Frederick Douglass begins giving a lecture on his relationship with John Brown. You probably familiar with this. In May of 1881, Douglass gives a dedication address at Anthony Hall, which is in Storr College. Storr College was an HBCU similar to Morgan State, Howard University in Harpers Ferry. And so Douglass in 1881 talks about John Brown, and he says that Brown had shared with him his plan to essentially start a rebellion, go to the Alleghenies, and that Brown had talked about this plan for years. And in Detroit, in February, March of 1859, Douglass and Brown have a meeting where I believe basically Brown said, this is it's go time. I am going to launch this raid sometime this year, you know, and I'm sure you know, as well as some of your viewers, that Douglass met with John Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. I don't know the exact date, but this was in the fall of 1859. And Douglass
said, hell no, I ain't going to kill myself. You go ahead, though.
Yeah, Douglass said that John Brown was willing to die for the slave, or Frederick Douglass would live for the slave. And
Harriet Tubman too. Harriet Tubman's like, I ain't gonna be able to do it, John.
Yeah, John Brown was someone who, I mean, he's been remembered in American history as a martyr. You know, for
did you see Ethan's clip of him? The Good Lord Bird. Ethan Hawke played John Brown in The Good Lord Bird. And so look, some people give John Brown the rap like he was crazy. Well, he's my kind of crazy, because I'm thinking like this. God forbid, if I'm in chains, I don't give a damn who coming to get me. I'm just ready to go. And if it's John Brown, we going on that train. Like the red eye, we getting up out of here. So he's going to always be my hero, right up there with Harriet Tubman, because he put his life on the line, dying for what he thought was right. And if that's crazy, then that's my kind of crazy.
Well, John Brown was very determined. He believed that he had been called like religiously by God, that he was kind of on a divine mission. It's like the Malcolm X quote, you know, a man that doesn't stand for anything, or it's kind of almost goes back to basically where John Brown was someone who took a very radical stance and a radical position, as we've been discussing, was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to his cause, which his cause, as Frederick Douglass had said, was John Brown's cause was the same as Frederick Douglass's cause, just the way that they their activism or methods were a little different.
John Brown was like DMX.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's a good yeah.
He believed in what he believed. The movie Good Lord Bird, I thank goodness for that movie. You know, so often people tell the story of history, and what I appreciate about you already, John, I think you just tell the story and you let people figure it out for what it is, but you just share the facts. Come on, tell me something about Frederick Douglass that we don't know. I hear you gonna, you know what, we better thank too Marcel Humphrey. Big ups to Marcel, a friend. And I tell you, man, he took care of his grandma with the most loving care. And I say that because so many people find themselves now in a position of having to take care of their parents, their grandparents, and not everybody is cut out for it. Hey, John, not everybody is cut out to take care of their parents. Mm-hmm. We think we tough. taking care of someone is a whole other ball of wax. So I thank God for Marcel Humphrey for introducing me to you. So come on, share some history with us. And thank you.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate you reaching out. So, yeah, Mr. Humphrey is someone that over the years we have corresponded on social media through email. I came across, or maybe he sent me his presentation on Frederick Douglass was a suffragist, abolitionist, proponent of education. Douglass was someone who was very active in a lot of different endeavors. And one of the things, as you know, and promote kind of economics and business and wealth building. Frederick Douglass was someone who the mythology of Frederick Douglass in history has obscured his financial acumen. And Marcel Humphrey is, I know of no other historian, professional, community, local, no one else who has understood or researched and understands as Marcel does that Frederick Douglass was someone who utilized real estate to advance his own finances, but then the finances of his family. In terms of Douglass was someone who in terms of generational wealth is a term you hear like a lot today. And there are disparities between white America, black America. There's all sorts of statistics, et cetera, et cetera. And so Douglass, I believe, and I mean, I cannot speak for Marcel, but I believe that Douglass, in terms of his real estate investing, was doing it in a way so that his children and even his grandchildren would have, I guess the old term was a piece of the rock. And so Marcel has done research into Douglass's, and he's done wonderful research. I believe his presentations are available on YouTube, or they're out there, and they're very informative. I haven't talked to Marcel about.
You learn from Marcel, I mean, as studied as you are. Well, and that's a reminder that nobody has a monopoly.
Well, with history, with local history, and also with figures such as Harriet Tubman, Douglass, I don't necessarily know as much about John Brown, but there are within these little communities.
You know.
But I mean that there's a lot of territorialism. There's differences between local historians and people at universities. Then you have interpretive National Park Services involved. There's this complicated ecosystem or community, whereas Marcel has, I think, found a very fascinating, understudied element of Frederick Douglass's public life as well as his private life in terms of his business. And I'll try to keep this short. Whereas Douglass had real estate investments in Rochester, New York. He maintained those real estate investments in Rochester, New York, up until the time that he died. Interesting little fact related to John Brown is when John Brown's raid failed in Harper's Ferry, Douglass was implicated, and the United States Marshals were headed towards his home in Rochester to apprehend him.
Oh my God! They had warrants. They had a warrant on Freddie.
They had a warrant for Mr. Douglass. Governor Wise of Virginia put out a warrant for his arrest. So Douglass knew the telegraph operator in Rochester, because the telegraph operator in Rochester was the person who managed Frederick Douglass's real estate properties when Douglass was out of town. His name was Frank Blackasall. Interesting little note. Basically, so the telegraph operator told Douglass, the marshals are coming for you. Douglass then fled to Canada, and essentially he came back to the United States after his name had been cleared. But with that said, so Douglass had real estate investments in Rochester, Rochester, New York, Washington, D.C. He had several properties that when he passed away, his children inherited these properties. His home on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is one example. There's another home on 17th Street in Washington, D.C. that his son Lewis lived in. Some people know about Highland Beach in Anne Arundel County, which Douglas's youngest son, Charles Douglas, was a developer of. Also, for those familiar with Fells Point, you know Douglas Place. Douglas Place were 4 properties that Frederick Douglass financed, built in the 1892. This is where the old Methodist church that Frederick Douglass used to go to as a teenager was there. And so all that said, Marcel has done a incredibly thorough job of presenting Douglass as a real estate investor as an educational tool to, I think, encourage and inspire people such as himself who are shrewd investors and see the value of real estate in terms of helping their family as well as the community. Because Douglas's involvement with real estate, for example, Douglas Place in Fells Point was it was obviously a business venture, but also Douglas, this is before you had housing laws. So basically Douglas was not going to discriminate against teachers, young professionals, basically black folks that might have had a harder time getting housing in other areas. Douglas opened up these housing opportunities. I mean, that's not the best way to explain it.
I did not know that. Now, I've been in Harlem. I'm a big fan of New York. There was a man named Philip Payton, for future research for you. Philip Payton, they call him the godfather of Harlem. He brokered, if I'm not mistaken, he was the first African-American to broker a real estate deal in New York City. And he brokered a deal between 2 white property owners who didn't like each other. Philip Payton. Fascinating history. Okay, so Douglas, all right, Marcel.
And let me do one thing, because I have some books here. So this gentleman, this is a book on Senator.
I've seen him before.
Yeah, Senator Blanche Bruce. So Blanche Bruce was a senator from Mississippi. He was the first Black American to serve a full term in the United States Senate. He was also the first Black American to have his signature on U.S.
He's the first?
He was the first Black American to serve a full term. So he served from 1874 to 1881, representing Mississippi in the United States Senate.
I thought it was Hiram Revels.
He was the first Black American to be seated in the U.S. Senate, but he did not serve a full term. He actually served out the remaining term of Jefferson Davis.
You are bad.
I mean, it's okay. So
what's his name again?
Blanche Bruce. So Senator, this book is called The Senator and the Socialite. The author of this book just passed away recently. So anyway, I'm sharing this because Blanche Bruce was a money man. He was very involved in investing in real estate in Washington, D.C. Senator Bruce was very active in Baltimore. Douglas and Bruce frequently took the train up to Baltimore to speak at benefit events, to attend civil rights rallies, to attend parades. And Senator Bruce was appointed to the Registry of the Treasury under President McKinley. He's the first Black American to have his signature on United States currency. Frederick Douglass and Senator Bruce they were basically investors together on several real estate ventures. So I just wanted to share that.
How the hell do you know that, John? How do you know this?
Well, just over the years of researching, and years ago in the DC archives, I was looking for Frederick Douglass in the index of his properties, and I saw several entries where basically Senator Bruce and Douglass had to purchase lots together. No, and the short explanation is that no one that I know of other than Marcel Humphrey has even begun to scratch the surface of Frederick Douglass and investments, Frederick Douglass in real estate. When Frederick Douglass passed away, he still had stock in a local streetcar company in Anacostia. So Douglass was someone who he diversified his portfolio, if you will.
I mean, as you're talking, John, honestly, so many things are racing across my mind. Pony Express, Telegraph, contrasting that with today, the internet, email. As much as things have changed, the more they change, the more they stay the same.
Well,
I'm glad to know that historically, a picture is painted of Black America like Roots, Alex Haley, black and white. And we thank you for shedding light, because we know it was a much more complicated picture. I mean, hell, much of what we know is through, would you agree, through the English lens of history? We never even talk about France and Spain. I mean,
well,
Spain owned Florida till 1831. Did you know you could escape to Florida and get your freedom if you were a slave?
I'm not totally versed on the Spanish occupation of Florida, but it did last up until the early 1830s. You had the Seminole War, and much of the country also up until the early 1800s was technically owned by the French. You had the Dutch that owned part of New York. Sojourner Truth actually spoke I guess Dutch is the term. To answer your question, Mr. Glover, I took some time to review your videos. I saw your interview with Mr. Philip Merrill, who I admire as a historian, curator, archivist. And so I appreciate your approach to telling history the way it has not been told and uplifting history, because the I guess you could say maybe a Eurocentric viewpoint of American history has obscured kind of the real history from below. You have, I mean, Carter G. Woodson, I believe it was the 1920s. He had the Miseducation of the Negro, who kind of, and this was now almost 100 years ago, basically talked about how education in America was very Anglo-focused or Anglo-Saxon focused. And as my studying of Frederick Douglass has revealed, that one who studies history, let's say, is the way Benjamin Quarles did. Benjamin Quarles was a historian at Morgan State University. He was in the similar class of historians as John Hope Franklin, who, as you know, was from Oklahoma. And so Benjamin Quarles wrote books about, for example, the Negro and the American Revolution. Now that relates to Frederick Douglass, because on the eastern shore of Maryland, Frederick Douglass's grandmother, I guess, transacted business, was in the same community on the eastern shore as were Black veterans of the Continental Army who were free, who were either free when they served in the Continental Army or were freed as a result of their service in the Continental Army. You had the Revolutionary War Pension Act of 1818, which created a system in which veterans of the Continental Army could receive pensions. Now, for Black Americans, as a result of this act, if you were free and you could have witnesses vouch for you, and this was all done through like a court process, if you were free Black American, you could receive a pension. If you were still enslaved at that time, your owner or master would receive the pension. So with that said, Frederick Douglass,
well, you didn't get freedom.
Frederick Douglass knew veterans in the continent, veterans of the Continental Army who were free, who received pensions. This is in the 1820s, 1830s. So Frederick Douglass had an understanding of American history that, as you're talking about, was more complex and nuanced than just a one-dimensional roots sort of history about slavery, and I've also looked at your videos. Some may know Matthew D'Souza, the history of Maryland, who was a black legislator in like the 1630s. So also when Frederick Douglass gets to Baltimore, he knew black veterans of the War of 1812, like the defenders of Baltimore. So Frederick Douglass knew, and as I know you know and your viewers know, Baltimore on the eve of the Civil War had a larger free black population than New York, Philadelphia, and Boston combined. So within this free black community that Douglass knew in the 1820s, 1830s, you have basically a separate economy, a separate church networks, even though education had not been publicly funded at the time. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of different directions to go, but I think it is important that individuals such as Marcel Humphrey are given opportunities and platforms and speaking opportunities to tell a more dynamic, three-dimensional history of Frederick Douglass that can then inspire and encourage people today in a new way, as opposed to telling. Roots was a little before my time, but I think that
it was the first of its kind back there in 70, 76, 77. We had never seen anything for a whole week, and then it snowed. It was like an Armageddon type snow. So you were forced to watch it, and your teacher made you write a report on it.
When I was a kid, I used to watch Reading Rainbow, which LeVar Burton was the host of the show. But yeah, so with all that said, I think that Frederick Douglass still has been understudied, and that the way that, and like I said, Tubman is not my thing. People do Tubman, and that's wonderful. I just kind of stay in my own little lane. But I think Frederick Douglass lived such a complicated, nuanced life.
Well, you know, she had property in upstate New York.
Well, I know that Harriet Tubman,
Lewiston, New York, right next to Niagara. I've seen it, and everybody up there knows about it.
Yeah, I've never been to Tubman's burial site, which I believe is in Auburn, New York. I believe basically Tubman had like a sunrise assisted living, essentially, for
yes.
kind of I don't know if age, the term used to be aged women homes. But basically Tubman was a small, as you're saying, a small business owner who managed property, who raised money through philanthropic networks, and then used those connections to then give back to to individuals who needed some help. Which I was gonna say, that's another thing that's not told about individuals like Tubman and Douglass, is that they were in their own way philanthropists. Now, they might have come from enslavement, but throughout the course of their life, when they established the ability to give back, they did so, which I think that is a message that's not told, and I believe should be.
You're right. So you know that Frederick Douglass took over the Freedmen's Bank. They kind of gave him the Barack Obama job after everybody messed everything up. Well, go ahead, Frederick. You go ahead and take that. That's my impression. I could be wrong. But he also he was the second president of the Ship Caulkers Union, started by Isaac Myers in Baltimore, which was the foundation of what would become the National Labor Union. The first black National Labor Union.
Yes, the Chesapeake Maritime Railway Company, I believe that's the name of it. Isaac Myers was a gentleman that Douglass knew. I believe they knew each other in the 1820s, 1830s. Like, there's a gentleman named John Locks who owned a funeral home and was also—
You know about Mr. Locks?
Well, Douglass knew Mr. Locks. Douglass attended his funeral in 1884, and there was a story that basically said Douglass was in the back of the room and was like almost, I don't want to say sobbing uncontrollably, but basically that Douglass attended Mr. Locks' funeral and was very grief-stricken because he had known Mr. Locks for many, many years, and he was like one of his oldest friends. And
Wow.
with Mr. Myers, I believe Douglass was an investor or shareholder when that company was launched or founded in the late 1860s. I do not have all of the details, but Douglass was also involved in, there was the Alpha Savings and Trust Bank in DC in the late 1890s. Christian Fleetwood, who was from Baltimore, was involved. So Douglass was involved in like trade unions, or Douglass advocated also for what today would be known as vocational training. Back then it was known as industrial education or the mechanical arts. Douglass was an advocate for the Manassas Industrial School in 1894 was open. Douglass attended the opening address. So Douglass was someone who advocated for black lawyers, black doctors, but also basically said that black Americans could benefit from being carpenters, blacksmiths. And as you know, Douglass was a caulker, and Douglass kind of came up in the trades in Fells Point.
That's how he learned how to read, according to his narrative. It said he tricked a little white guy into teaching him his numbers. Can you imagine somebody, I know you know this, but I'm going to see how I can get you to teach me at a time when such things were punishable by death. Fascinating. John, you're just loaded. What is your favorite aspect of the life of Frederick Douglass?
Some of his adventures that he talks about as a kid in Fells Point are pretty interesting. They will capture the imagination of a young person if you read them. Also, I believe an adult, as you just alluded to. Douglass talks about how he would essentially take snacks from his house, and he would interact with these like Irish kids in Fells Point, and they had the benefit of going to school, whereas Douglass did not have the benefit of going to school. So Douglass would basically say like, "Hey, Tommy, hey, Billy, you know, are you a little hungry? I got this, Lunchables for you. I'll let you have this if you teach me what this word is or teach me what this phrase is." So I think Douglass was the foresight or the emotional intelligence that Douglass had to do this, I think, is very fascinating. He was an entrepreneur for his own self-education. That's I think one of the most interesting things too about Douglass is that Douglass is celebrated and acknowledged and recognized by the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the country. Yet Douglass never attended a formal day of school in his life. When he would lecture, and people would be they would be very impressed with his just delivery and show of world history, and they would say, "Miss Douglass, where did you go to school?" And so Douglass would say, "Massachusetts Abolitionist University, teacher or principal William Lloyd Garrison." So one of the things I think that what's empowering about Douglass is that he was self-taught. He was like a street historian, if you will. And Douglass was also someone who had the today they use the term code switching. So Douglass had the ability to code switch, or social intelligence, emotional intelligence, that he could hang with presidents and peasants. And
all right, now, all of that's fine, John, but these sisters watching the show only want to hear about one thing.
What's that?
From Anna to the white lady, because I've seen some of the sisters' commentaries, and without knowing the full story, it's easy for some to say, "Oh, the hell with that white lady," as if when he married the white lady, it was somehow disrespectful to Anna. But that's not my understanding. I mean, he was married to Anna, and then she died, and then he moved on with his life. But the sisters are hard on Freddie D when he married the white lady. Oh, it's one meme out there. Anna did all this for him. Next thing you know, he married to the white lady. And it shows how race can be so cruel that you miss the damn point.
Okay, that's a very sensitive, delicate topic of history. These 140 years later or so. I guess I'll explain it this way. That so as you know, as your viewers know, as historians know, Douglass and Anna connected in Baltimore. She was a couple years older than him. She was legally free. She was a free person, so she could move around differently than could Frederick. It is believed, and members of the family have communicated this, that it is within the realm of historic possibility that Frederick Douglass's grandmother, who was known for her midwifery skills on the Eastern Shore, that possibly Betsy Bailey actually delivered Anna Murray, and that actually Frederick Douglass's grandmother knew the Murray family, and that somehow, some way, Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray actually knew each other from the Eastern Shore. As a further addendum to that, Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman, who was born 1821, died 1895. He was the 7th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He lived in Baltimore for 65 years. Bishop Wayman writes in an autobiography that when he was a child, he was babysat by Anna Murray. And so you have this ecosystem of Bishop Wayman and Frederick Douglass were dear friends. They knew each other for decades. Bishop Wayman eulogized Frederick Douglass at his funeral in D.C. So it's possible that Douglass actually somehow, some way knew Anna from the Eastern Shore or knew of her family. So this could have
sound like an arranged marriage almost.
So all that said, I say that to say that the bond and affection or feeling between Frederick and Anna is something that I don't think historians or people, decades removed, it's very difficult to communicate it's difficult to describe in language the feelings and connections that Frederick and Anna would have had. There are members of the Bailey family on the Eastern Shore that are kind of guardians of her history and legacy. And there are still members of the Murray family on the Eastern Shore. So some of the willingness or ease at which people, I think, maybe slander Mr. Douglass and his wife and his marriage situation. I think it's
not knowing.
Yeah, and I not
knowing, and yeah, you draw your own conclusions.
And I think that's where I even begin? It's unfair
to put 2022 eyes on something that happened back then without knowing all the damn facts. That's the bottom line. So learn the facts first before talking smack. How about that?
Well said. Okay, so Anna and Frederick were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together. All of their 21 grandchildren were their children. Anna passes away in August of 1882. And by all accounts, Frederick Douglass was very, very depressed. He writes to a friend of his that if it were not for his family obligations, he would basically just wander the earth for the rest of his days because he was directionless. He didn't know what to do without his wife.
I've never heard that term before, a directionalist.
Yeah, Douglass wrote to a friend of his basically that he felt that he didn't forget the actual language that he used. But basically, Douglass says that now that I've lost my wife, I don't know how I can continue with my days because even when it's sunny, it's dark and cloudy. And what am I ever going to do? And
one of the first loves, so ain't no sunshine when she's gone. He He had the blues for real.
He that's a good way to put it. Douglass had the deep blues, and Douglass's family obligations and children and grandchildren kind of kept him grounded in Washington, where I do think that Douglass wanted, Douglass was such a public figure. People were always calling on him saying, Mr. Douglass, we'd like you to speak here. Can you give a lecture here? President wants to meet with you. You know, Supreme Court there's a Supreme Court nomination coming.
He was Todd.
He was Todd?
He was Todd. He was tired.
Okay, yeah.
He was Todd. Yeah, like put the damn phone on mute, cut the computer off. He just shut it down. I mean, think about that. This is no internet, no cell phones, no satellite. You getting Pony Express. You got the telegraph. He got 21 grandchildren. Oh my God, Grandpa, what's wrong? Oh, I miss your grandma. I miss your grandma, boy. Go sit down. Oh, Grandpa, you look all sad. In some kind of way, he met a new lady and his life carried on. I mean, what's wrong with that? But the sisters are hard on him. I can't believe him. He moved on with the white lady after all Anna did for it. You know, sometimes we are more brutal than those we point fingers at, John Muller.
I'm sorry. I got a little distracted here.
If I were you, I'd stay away from that question too. You sidestep.
I have some other things to add. So, okay, I'll say this, and then I have a couple books to share. So, in January of 1884, Frederick Douglass marries Helen Pitts. Helen Pitts was a white lady whose family had been an abolitionist family from upstate New York. Now, where do I begin? There is evidence. There is evidence and citations and information that
that he knew her from before.
Well, actually, yeah, there are accounts that actually Frederick Douglass had visited and spoke in Gideon Pitts, who was, Helen Pitts's father had welcomed Frederick Douglass into his house in the 1840s, 1850s. He was an abolitionist in New York. But then when Frederick Douglass married his daughter, Helen Pitts's father never spoke to her again. So he was an abolitionist only up to or an advocate for maybe abolitionism, but not social equality. But taking a step back, there's actually evidence
that was revolutionary back then, because in some places that could warrant death.
Well, in some states, I say some people say interracial. I say inter-American. But basically, the marriage between Helen Pitts and Frederick Douglass in 1884 was in fact legal in the District of Columbia, but it was illegal in Virginia. I don't know if it was illegal in Maryland, but I mean Virginia, was it Loving versus Virginia? That's 1967, I think, the 60s. Wow. So so there's evidence that Frederick Douglass actually was considering making a marriage proposal to a young woman, Black American woman in 1883. I believe that through networks that were closely affiliated with Howard University. Frederick Douglass was on the board of Howard University from 1872 to 1895. Frederick Douglass knew Fannie Jackson Coppin of Coppin State University. He knew Reverend Littleton F. Morgan of Morgan State University. So
Morgan was a white guy.
Reverend Morgan was a white guy. Mm-hmm. He was a Methodist minister.
Fannie was a black lady.
She was a black lady. Yes, she was a black educator.
Okay, you going fast. Okay, I just want to make sure I still know who's on first.
Right. Okay. So there's evidence that in 1883, Douglass was considering tendering a marriage proposal to a young black woman in her late 20s and or early 30s. The story, which is
Now, hold up. You've left us hanging for a minute. At this point, Frederick Douglass is what, 60, 70?
In 1883, he would have been 65-ish.
65 is messing with a 25-year-old.
Well, I don't know if I would use the word messing. Maybe he was talking. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, some of these, I want to be respectful.
I'm respectful too. 65, 25. Okay, I'm 57, 25. Okay, I know damn well if I want to live long.
You're very young, and just like Mr. Douglas, Mr. Glover, you're very young and vigorous.
You better leave that 25-year alone. She gonna have you in the damn hospital somewhere.
So
okay, I can't wait to hear how this unfolds.
Well, I'll give a little bit. There was a guy who worked in the DC government. His name was Hiram Ramsdell. He was actually journalist friend. He was friends with Mark Twain. And in 1883, he writes a letter for a Philadelphia newspaper that says there is speculation in Washington that Mr. Douglass is going to take a young woman for his wife, and describes the lady as being, I guess the term would be a light-skinned black lady. Now, I have heard through oral history that the story is that the young lady politely declined Douglas's. Now, I don't know if Douglas made a formal marriage proposal, but basically the discussion was going on that the young lady essentially said that the responsibilities of being Mrs. Frederick Douglass and going to benefit affairs and, you know, going to the White House and doing all these other things is a little more than I'm
gonna be able to do all that.
Yeah, it's a little more than I'm ready to take on. And then this woman and Douglas reportedly remained friends, and or Douglas remained friendly with the group of people in which this young lady was from. And I don't mean to be
the light-skinned people. Okay.
Yeah, I don't mean to be evasive with the details. It's just I have not.
We're gonna work this out. What you can't say, I will say.
Well. Here's another thing, just to for your viewers, as you as well. So, Reverend Francis Grimke. Reverend Francis Grimke was a black minister from the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Reverend Grimke officiated Frederick Douglass's second marriage to Helen Pitts, and this gentleman, Senator Bruce, was one of the witnesses of Douglass's second marriage. In the 1920s, Reverend Grimke wrote an article for Dr. Woodson's Journal of Negro History, and he talks about Douglass's second marriage. And in the first paragraph or two, Reverend Grimke says that Frederick Douglass's marriage to Helen Pitts, the white lady, caught him and the rest of black society in Washington by surprise, because the word on the street that there was a young lady or two, a little younger than Mr. Douglass, that Mr. Douglass was
she was a lot younger than Mr. Douglass. Mr. Douglass was pimping. He was pimping.
I can't say that.
I said it. Douglass was pimping. Hey, it's nice to learn of a man. I'm proud of Frederick Douglass. I don't care what they say. Black, white, up, down.
Well,
when I'm gonna tell you when I fell in love. Can I tell you when I fell in love with him?
Yes,
the Mr. Covey story. They sent them to Mr. Covey to be broken, and he wasn't having it. That right there, John, that will never ever leave my mind. And it's beyond slavery. It's like facing your bully. It's like facing your biggest fear. If you grew up somewhere around DC, if you grew up anywhere, you had a bully. There was some situation or person that we all have to deal with, that we either gonna face it or run from it. Everybody.
Well said. Yes, the battle with Mr. Covey happened when Douglass was around 15, 16 years old on the Eastern Shore. And that's kind of one of, by Douglass's admission, was one of the defining moments of his life.
Damn right. It was do or die.
If we have a couple moments, I'll do a couple of Frederick Douglass books if you don't mind.
Please.
All right. So
I'm gonna fall off the screen. Give you a bigger screen.
Okay. This was published in 1980, called Young Frederick Douglass by Dixon Preston, Johns Hopkins University Press. It's a great book. It talks about Douglass on the Eastern Shore, and the historian that did this book found several documents that had never been found before. And actually, because of Dixon Preston, we know that Frederick Douglass was born in 1818, where in Douglass's life, he thought he was born in 1817. All right. Now, I do not have, this is, let's see if you can see this. This is Frederick Douglass edited by Benjamin Quarles. Now, Benjamin Quarles in 1948, Benjamin Quarles of Morgan State University is the first modern biographer of Frederick Douglass. He's also the first modern Black American biographer of Frederick Douglass. Benjamin Quarles was a contemporary to John Hope Franklin, to Rayford Logan, very preeminent, prominent Black historians. I believe Professor Quarles died in 95, 96. And Professor Quarles was responsible for a statue of Frederick Douglass being erected on the campus of Morgan State's campus in 1956. And I believe that statue was the first statue of Frederick Douglass in the state of Maryland. So Professor Quarles, Morgan State University, were very integral into uplifting Frederick Douglass history at a time when not many others were. This is Professor Quarles writes about Douglass before the modern civil rights movement. All right, now, and this is actually a collection of essays, so I apologize. I don't have the cover of Mr. Quarles' book on Douglass. It's somewhere around here, but you can find it at libraries. All right, this guy, Philip Foner. This is from 1951. Philip Foner is the uncle to contemporary historian today, Eric Foner at Columbia University. This is a wonderful biography of Douglass, published in 1951. Professor Benjamin Quarles and Philip Foner are some of the earliest biographers of Frederick Douglass. So these are some great books. Also, Dixon Preston's book. They don't talk about Douglass and politics. This is an interesting book, The Negro in Maryland Politics, 1870 to 1912. Tragically, Frederick Douglass is not even mentioned in this book, and Douglass was very involved in Maryland politics following the Civil War. And for example, in Baltimore, Douglass knew several mayors of Baltimore, including Mayor Ferdinand Latrobe, who Douglass considered to be a personal friend. What else we got? Oh, show this book. So this is a book I wrote about 10 years ago now, Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. I have to get my publisher to send you a copy, Mr. Glover. You can find this.
Hold up. You got a book on this?
Yeah, you might not have known. So you can find this wherever good books are sold. You can get a copy at the Pratt Library, or if any libraries in the state of Maryland have this book, Frederick Douglass in D.C. And I give walking tours. You can find.
I need you to hold your book all the way up.
Sure. Okay. So the title is Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C., The Lion of Anacostia. I have considered doing a book on Frederick Douglass in Baltimore for several years. It just has not yet materialized. When that book is published, we'll have to have another conversation, Mr. Glover.
Wow.
So
he was in Southeast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's his home right there in Southeast.
You know, when I come to D.C., I've always been a fan of Southeast, primarily because that's where Marion Barry was. But you've added a whole other century or 2 centuries on top of that. We've covered so much today, from Benjamin Banneker all the way to this little little AKA that was trying to knock off Frederick Douglass. You want to leave that alone, John Muller. Okay, so John, we got to bring you back. How can people get in touch with you?
Sure. People can find me.
How do you make money? Do they hire you? You get honorariums? Because we want you to get paid for the history that you have shared. I mean, this is what you do full time, John?
Well, my day job is I work as a reference librarian. So I work in information services. I work for a library.
Have you ever thought to run for office, John?
When I was younger, I used to consider that, but now that I've gotten older and seen politics, I'm more interested in being kind of an outside activist.
Well, maybe you could advise elected leaders, because when we have elected officials, I mean, you gave me some history. I got notes, buddy. I'm taking notes on the damn. I couldn't stop. But when you were Matthew D'Souza, Christian Fleetwood, Blanche Bruce, Ferdinand Latrobe, we have to, when you have people who don't know history, any color, they're missing out on half of the world. If you don't know your history, you don't know where we've come from and where we can go. I think you have a better grasp. We need you to advise some of these people. And how you gonna be president like Trump and you don't know history? You can't appreciate the beauty that we actually have. It's easy to focus on, oh, you white, I'm black, and that's it. Come on, man. It's much more to life than what's on the surface.
Well, I guess I'll give so yeah, people can go to tinyurl.com/lost history tours. That's tinyurl.com/lost history tours, or you can just search John Muller, Frederick Douglass walking tours. The Lion of Anacostia book is available at libraries, bookstores. I will give a quick shout out. I'm giving a talk on the lost history of Frederick Douglass in Howard County on November 1st, which is a Tuesday, November 1st, 7 p.m. at the Elkridge Branch Library, Elkridge Library in Elkridge, Maryland. I will be discussing Frederick Douglass in Howard County, which has a lot of overlap with Baltimore. Douglass would attend camp meetings and other events at a place where Baltimoreans and Washingtonians would come off the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And you can find me on Twitter.
Don't you want your own show?
I've considered that, and I have a friend of mine that we've tried to we've never gotten it off the ground. I have to commend you, Mr. Glover, because I see that you keep a very, very active, busy schedule of interviews and editorials and reportage. And I also just want to commend all the work that you've done in your community, because you are someone that individuals such as yourself, Mr. Glover, who Frederick Douglass worked with in all sorts of various communities. And Douglass would frequently, when he would come to these communities, he would go on shows such as yours. He would stay in their homes. He would give like a benefit lecture to benefit their show or their organization. And it was through these networks that Douglass was able to make a difference. But he didn't make the difference himself. He made the difference working with others.
Well, you are a great American, John, because you have shared, you have enlightened. And I pray that the good Lord blesses you with any and everything that you want. You have opened people's eyes. And I can only imagine what you may go through, or what some people may say from the cheap seats about you. But I'm glad that you follow your own damn moral compass and you think for yourself. You have enlightened me. Thank you. And there are other people out here. I mean, they're sending you all kinds of notes about it continually evolve when people care enough. Yes, you care enough to spend time and to share these facts. Thank you, John. Big ups to your parents and the people who raised you, because you're dynamic. Oh, we got a cat. He all the way from Frederick. He down in Florida. Everybody.
Sure.
So look at this guy. I've known this guy about 20 years. Don't he look like Frederick Douglass?
He definitely has the Frederick Douglass beard and the kind of the snowy white bush. Yeah. I give a quick acknowledgement to Denise Moore, my significant other. She's very supportive. Also, I see in the comments on YouTube, Howard County, Maryland, Black History. There's a young lady named Marlena Giroux, who Marlena Giroux works primarily in Howard County, but also throughout kind of the Baltimore, D.C. area. She may be a wonderful person to have on a future show of yours, Mr. Glover.
We'd love to have her.
Marlena is a local historian working to shed new uplift the history of Howard County, Black American history in Howard County through never before known history. She gives public presentations. I saw her comment. So it's through kind of this network of local historians. We're all trying to work together to just
commend you though, bro. Easily you could have a different attitude, and I'm just glad that you don't. See, some people, especially in Baltimore, as much as we want Baltimore to be less color conscious, I mean, you know about the 1910 ordinance by J. Barry Mahul, the father of segregation. Blacks couldn't move into white neighborhoods, whites couldn't move into black neighborhoods. And the day I just talked with the editor of the Baltimore Banner. She's from California, Asian American lady. And she said when she got here, she was hoping that Baltimore was not still just black and white. But it is. And the only way to heal that is with information and conversation and realizing, okay, you might not like this person because of this or this or that, but you might come to find, what if they saved your life? Would you think that way still? You never know where your blessings might come from. There's some black people I want to push in the harbor and some white people. It don't matter. I like good people, and you are a reminder of good people.
Thank you, Mr. Glover. I have the same feeling for you as well. It's been an honor to be on your show. Hope we can do this again. We can follow up. If you need anything from me, let me know. Thank you for everyone who made comments and viewed on YouTube or Facebook. And Mr. Glover is very active. Please follow him on Twitter and subscribe to his YouTube page and hit the like button on this video.
John, it's truly a pleasure. I did not know you had a book, and it's on my list. We have to bring you to Baltimore. We have to bring you to Baltimore. I'm convinced.
I do a walking tour in Fells Point every couple months. I will send you the information. Maybe you can join the next time we have it. It'd be great to have you.
No, we're going to celebrate you. I think we need to invite you to our 20th anniversary and make sure even more people know about your great work. And your greatness is in your kindness. I mean, you've done the work, but I appreciate your kindness and willingness to share with others. That's the beautiful part about you, John. And thanks again to Marcel Humphrey.
Yes, thank you, Marcel. Big shout out to Marcel. Thank you.
Good deal. We're going to get out of here, and we'll circle back for the next time, John.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Great day, everybody. Good morning, world.